And welcome back to Breaking Ground on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon. You can contact us on social media at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. This week, I'm chatting to Paul Mitchell, a returning guest from Mitchell McDermott. Paul, you're very welcome. I tend to call on you whenever we see the construction industry in a state of crisis. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's. I looked at my notes and I saw it was last July that I was speaking to you last. So unfortunately, if we're speaking every 6 months, something is up.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. Look, you might just break down some, because at the moment there seems to be a lot of almost conflicting headlines around construction and delivery, and maybe we're conflating the two issues. So maybe can you talk to us about really the current state of construction? I know that's a big question, but where are we as we enter into 2023?
Sure, yeah. I might just touch on inflation first, because I think that's the burning question from everybody. Our info cards that we produce each year, or in some cases our inflation one is every 6 months, are due out in a week's time. But each year we price the same office block each year, and then during COVID we started doing the same thing, but in much more detail in material wise with apartments. And so we've kind of concluded that for 2022. And what we've seen is that basically it was a year of two halves. On the apartment side, we had inflation of just under 7% in 6 months. We had predicted 6 to 7% for the year, and then we had it in 6 months. And actually, the last time I was on with you in July, I said probably 9.5% for the year. And actually, our figures have come out to 9.6% for the year.
Very close.
So very much we had high inflation driven by the Ukraine invasion. And then we had plateauing in the second half of the year and reduction. Right? Now, interestingly, so 9.6% on apartments, which will cover any of that type of buildings, hotels, etc. Offices, 12%, because it's more exposed to more expensive materials like glass, aluminium, steel, mechanical, electrical. So that's interesting. The last 2 years is the first time we've actually started to kind of separate inflation into different building types. And we see that inflation is kind of over four areas: labor, material, supply, demand, and risk. And supply demand is basically the supply of contractors, and I'll come on to that. But over 80% of the materials that we were tracking were either at 0% or less than that in Q4. So I think that's positive news, if we can talk about positive news in the market. But a year of two halves.
That's an interesting one when you hear it broken down, because it seems to me that there are maybe separate conversations going on around labor. So taking materials outside of it, labor, supply and demand, and risk. And risk, when I speak to anybody within the industry, risk is always the first thing they talk about, because it seems to be a case of hot potato. Nobody wants to be left holding things at a certain stage. And while the government made some concessions last year, which was a good leadership position to take, whether it went far enough or not, I suppose is another point. But has the private sector shared that approach?
Probably much more so.
Okay.
They've had to. So the risk has shifted from contractors back to clients. So through contract clauses, through design responsibility, through inflation clauses, Ukraine clauses, energy clauses, got all these new clauses, which basically means if something bad happens, I'm not left with all of it. I might be left with some of it, or client, you need to take that risk. And to be honest, that's prudent on behalf of contractors. We've seen, unfortunately, a number of subcontractors, big subcontractors, go out of business last year, which is, it's really sad to see. And so they are being careful, and they should be,
Okay, but again, I suppose this is maybe for new contracts. Where are we in terms of legacy contracts that are waiting, that are still in the process of being delivered?
People have had to kind of say, look, I'm not entitled to it under the contract. but I'm struggling here. I've got 5 million of extra costs. I have no recovery under the contract, but I'm gonna have to do something. Otherwise, I won't be able to deliver your building. And there's lots of those very difficult. The smart clients are having rational discussions with their contractors because it's not if they're making. Yes, they signed up to it, but if you force that, you would probably force that contractor out of business, and then you're left with a semi-completed building. Now, contractors.
You say the smart project owners are having these conversations. Is that typical in the marketplace?
I would say it's typical. I'd say everyone's having the conversation. It's to what extent financially they're having the conversation. And and I think that's very mixed. There's no, every single project at different stages within the project is a different conversation. So, but I think generally there's an understanding out there that this is not just gouging. This is I'm really struggling here, and my subby could go out of business if you don't do something.
Is that feeding into, there's a narrative at the moment around projects that have been granted planning but are not proceeding, and you can break this down into the residential and commercial space, or really, I suppose our immediate focus is of course on the residential, but have you any line of sight of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was asked to do a presentation at the planning conference in early November. And that was one of the questions they asked before I went to, what do you want to know? Why is a commercial person speaking at a planning event? They said, well, I want to know, why do we put all this effort into granting planning and assessing planning applications, granting permission, and then they just sit there? And the narrative out there is developers hoarding land, they're greedy, they're trying to get the money, and they're just getting planning to add value and then not do anything. So what we actually did was we took all 457 planning applications under the SHD, that was the old fast track method. And we went through all those, as we do each year, but this year we added another piece on. We said we cross-referenced the ones that have planning with the ones with the BCMS to see what's actually started, plus our own knowledge, but to try and make it as evidence-based as possible. And then we went down through all those schemes, and what we found was that there's 29,000 units not started. Okay, so you said that's a lot of units. They've got planning permission. Why haven't they started? So we went down through 88 schemes, 29,000 units, and that could be described that 3/4 of that can be answered with 4 reasons.
Okay. And
the first reason is a third of those units that haven't started are regional apartments. Now, we struggle to get apartments to stack up in Dublin. And so it's nigh on impossible. And these are schemes in Drogheda, Louth, Kilkenny, Cork, Limerick, Galway, right? And we'll come on to Creecunna, but that was set up to address that. So a third of them regional apartments, 17% of them site sale, right? So someone had the site and they sold it. Now, either they flipped that site for planning gain, or they sold it, and I can see some of it, they sold it because they couldn't actually fund it or deliver it. 17% viability and 10% were recent grants. So that's 3/4 of it. And there are other reasons. Some of them started, some of them were in JR, but actually came out again. And some of them, 15%, we have TVA. There's no reason that we can see why they haven't commenced, because they're housing schemes. In some cases, the developer has a number of housing schemes, so they're only getting to the end, so there's a delay in that point. But I think one point to add, in our info card that's coming out, we actually just put in a program to say if you have a scheme of 150 apartments, it takes about 4 years to get from site purchase to your first apartment being delivered. That's with no planning delays and no JR, right? 4 years. So it takes, but I think that piece, and we'll publish this, but it debunks that theory that all developers are sitting on all land and just waiting for money. And that's fact-based. And I actually presented that at the planning conference, which was interesting to see.
That's an interesting one. When you talk about 17% viability, that's in as a separate issue to 1/3 of them being regional apartments, because we know there's viability issues impacting regional apartments. So are you saying that the other 17% viability issues are pertaining to housing?
They are all either student apartments or housing within the SHD. So, and to be honest with you, that percentage is just going to significantly
increase. And I mean, you talk about 4 years where there are no planning delays and no JR, but and obviously I know from your own data that the proportion of JRs in the first 4 years of the scheme was shockingly high. And it's, you know, it's something that gets talked about a lot in the media, and we know that there's changes. But obviously An Bord Pleanála has been really, I'm not sure the most diplomatic way to describe it, but it's certainly been in turmoil since the changes were touted around JR. So where does that leave? Where does that leave the industry at the moment? What options does it have?
I think there's an interesting point on two of those things that you mentioned. So JRs last year, 58% of planning permissions last year were caught in JR, right? 14,500 units. And what would you think if I was to ask you, Carol, to switch this interview back? Would you think it's higher or lower or the same this for 2022 in terms of percentages of JR?
Oh, I'd imagine it's much higher because the public is riled up. You know, we see it across our own placemaking endeavour. So I would imagine it's much higher. And unfortunately, if we were to continue in the way we're going, it would continue to get higher. Planning is a public function, but the public has never been so engaged as they are now. So am I right?
Well, I would have been of exactly the same opinion as you.
And it's not.
19%.
Why? What's the explanation for that?
Well, it's tied up with two things, right? Because the other big shift since last year is that 58% of last year's planning applications are still sitting to be decided upon. 58%, right? So there's 29,000 units, right, that have yet to be decided upon by the board. Now, this is the point at which I kind of go, we've got lots of problems in this industry. We know all about An Bord Pleanála, and I think it's a real shame, right? And it'll be fixed, right? We'll get through it. But here is something that with an investment can be sorted, right? Can we go to the Irish planning consultants and second people in for 6 months? Can we go to the UK and bring in a team and bring in 10 or 20 people and clear this backlog? Like, there is a shocking waste of value happening in the market because planning isn't being delivered. And that to me is not tied up with the Attorney General. It's not tied up with the governance of the board. It is resource. And to me, I just, that bit there is an issue.
Paul, I've had conversations with planners who would not take that position, irrespective of the pay that was on offer.
Well, at that planning conference, and I was in a space that I'm not usually in, but I was talking to people that I'm not usually having those conversations with, and it was an eye-opener for me. And an assistant planner of a big council said to me, I said, that seems to be good news about the board positions. She said, everybody wants to work for the board. Right now, that's as much information as I know. Right.
Great. That's what we need. That's what we need. But unfortunately, on the ground, the body is so damaged that people are concerned about their careers. And not only that, but actually there was a lot of muckraking and very personal things. Not many people will put themselves in the line of fire for that.
No, and there is that, but you know, we'll get through that, right? And I think that's short term, and we'll get through it, and it's a crying shame. But you know, but like the fundamentals there, and the problem is this change is mixed with the rise in interest rates, with the exit of the funds. There's a number of things coming together again to stop units being delivered. Now, this is where I think we need like a 2-year emergency, right? It has to be treated like there's lots of meetings going on. The Taoiseach was meeting last Tuesday with lots of industry bodies. He met with the Housing Commission the week before, right? The first day back after the Christmas break on that Tuesday, met with the Housing Commission. But it has to be an emergency. We're running a budget surplus, right? We need money. The industry needs money. And forget all this negative narrative about developers and cuckoo funds and all that kind of stuff. We need housing, right? We've got a viability issue. The country has funds. We can't invite people into this country because they've got nowhere to live because the prices are too high, right? You know, this is very much, this can be worked through. It takes time and it needs a politician that will stand firm and not cancel co-living and not cancel build to rent because there's so much political pressure. It just needs an emergency and it needs that big investment and it needs it now. And these kind of things should be just pushed through.
Paul, that's so compelling when I hear you say that, and I feel like it's something that there are certainly branches of government and opposition that would back that. But then, right, so we get the resources. Do our contractors have the capacity to deliver?
That is, that's the next challenge to be overcome. Like we added 25,000 workers last year, according to the CSO, right? Very welcome. But from what I see on the ground and from what our business sees on the ground, it's an industry still constrained, right? I do not see, we do not have contractors knocking down our doors looking for work, right? We are knocking their doors. And we're knocking on the same doors for different projects every other week, right? Because we don't have the new blood in the marketplace, right? We've got a new change since probably yesteryear. The larger contractors, maybe from 100 million up, have anything from 10 to 50% of their work overseas now. They've said we're not going to get caught like others and like we got caught the last time. We're going to have a pressure release valve, and they've done very well with it. Are they going to take projects here that are kind of just about, the viability and the client doesn't have the money to pay, or are they going to build data centers in Norway? Okay, so that's an issue. And I think the COVID interruption is still affecting, the subcontractor supply chains. So I think be careful what you wish for. We could get all these plannings through and do everything we said about the 2-year emergency, but the contracting space is also an emergency, right? So where are we? Where is your country needs you? Signs over in Australia and America and Europe and the UK. Like we should be trying to get our people back from the UK, right? Where things aren't as rosy and they're going through the rocket patch. Give them an incentive to get them back into the country, right? And just ramp the whole thing up together. That's what's needed. That's why that 2-year emergency to focus on all of those things at the same time is needed.
Paul, it occurs to me that we could almost take this conversation full loop and come back to risk, because obviously if we're making it a more attractive environment for contractors, then actually it's not just a case of bringing back people to work, but actually maybe for new contractors, because we see that there's a cohort of successful contractors now who are probably in the mid-level who all started between 2008 and 2011. So maybe this is the time for the next generation of contractor who are coming into the market at a time when arguably we've a more sophisticated client, arguably a more mature supply chain, and a better risk profile in terms of contracts than we've had for decades.
Yeah, and you know what? Like Ireland is not alone. Part of the study, we're doing this international cost benchmarking study at the moment for the government. And talking to people in lots of other countries, right? And I spoke to this chap about it that had a German commission on the reduction of construction costs. And it happened in 2014, 2015. And they spent 2 years working on this. And they came up with 71 recommendations, 16 of which were implemented, and costs went up. And in that conversation that I had with this economist, right, you could interchange the word Germany for Ireland in any of it. You could do the same in the States. The last 5 days been involved in something in the States. And you can interchange the words. Like affordability, social housing, cost rental, construction costs, viability. Everybody has the same issues. And Ireland is, not alone. And I think, to be honest, we're doing a lot of things right in this country. A lot of things right in the construction industry. Our health and safety, our building control. People are now, the UK and other European countries are trying to copy us in what we're doing, which is great to see. But But that piece about dragging people back, I think, is and growing those new band of contractors, I think, absolutely.
Paul, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I always learn so much from you. Before we finish up today, you know, I think you made a very compelling call for this really an emergency to be called.
Yeah.
But what are your expectations? What not necessarily what you'd like to see, but what are your expectations of 2023 for the industry?
I think the LDA are going to play a major role. I think the one gap is funding. So people have lost their exit, a fund, to buy something or rent something, and people have lost their funding. I think the bigger developers who are funded are going to take over. I think the smaller developers or developers who are without funding are going to have their sites purchased off them. It'll be interesting to see what the residential zone land tax will do. I think that's going to cause lots of problems. I think we're just going to have lots of legal cases. And I don't know if you have a site that hasn't got planning, that has planning, but is not viable. And next thing you're going to be charged 3% per annum from the 1st of January 2024. I just think it's going to make the situation worse. I think it will come around, but I think this year people are still going to work through what they have. They're going to get out of the COVID projects, as I call them. I think the government will make interventions. I hope they make deep interventions on funding and exits, but they also need to address the supply side. And I think we won't see corrections from a cost, but we'll see plateauing, we'll see general reduction. I don't think we'll see a major correction until Q4 of this year. And I don't think it'll be a major correction. I think there'll be a correction in pricing only if the interventions haven't been made and schemes stop being built. Only then will we see kind of a change in the cost side, but we do need to see it.
Paul, I could talk to you all day, and I feel there's so much more that we could say, but that's always time for today. Thank you so much. Plenty of food for thought there. I appreciate it always. And also, you mentioned at the top of the interview those info cards. So your new versions are due out next week. So I'd recommend that people take a look at those. I know we ourselves, and we have clients who use them like a Bible, stacked on, printed and put on the desk. There's very little gets printed now, but they get printed. So thank you so much. That was Paul Mitchell of Mitchell McDermott. And that's it from us this week. You can get in touch with the show on social media at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. As always, my thanks to the Hear Me Roar production team and to Luke Delaney on sound for Dublin South FM. Until next time, thank you for listening.